Welcome to the New York State ASBO webinar, Crisis Response Fundamental Cost Analysis. Your speaker for today's program is Tim Hilker. The sponsor for today's program is Building Controls and Services, Inc. Operator assistance is available at any time during this conference by pressing £0. A question and answer session will follow the presentation. You may send chat questions during the presentation using the chat window indicated by a speech bubble icon located to the right of the presentation. I will now turn the call over to our host. Steve, please begin.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Steve Van Hoosen. I'm the Director of Government Relations and Professional Services here with ASBO, and I'm happy that you've joined us. I just would like to say thank you to Tim Hilker for putting this presentation together. Tim is the District Treasurer at the Niagara-Wheatfield Central School District out in western New York. And we will also wanted to thank our Building Controls and Services for helping to support our webinar series. As Michelle said, we will have a question and answers at the end. So as you think of your questions, if you don't want to chat them in or type them in, you will have the opportunity to call in and ask your questions live. So we will, again, repeat how to do that when we get to the Q&A after the slide presentation. So again, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Tim. And why don't you begin?
All right. Thanks a lot, Steve. And thanks a lot, everyone, for joining us today. The first thing I wanted to do was to go over this is sort of a follow-up to the Roots of the Crisis webinar that Karen Dumfrey presented on, I believe it was a couple weeks ago. And so for those of you that didn't get to attend that, I just kind of wanted to go through that because I think it's sort of a fundamental piece of, as we discuss some of the ways we can cope with this, is also understanding the causes. His presentation was broken down basically into 5 parts. The first one was sort of some of the causes, then the impact on our economy, the government's response, the impact on our state, and then sort of talked about when schools will return to normal. Some of the causes he discussed were the credit easing back in the late 90s and early 2000s when credit was kind of shoved down people's throats. Just shortly before that, the dot-com bust. More recently, the housing bubble and the subprime mortgages. And he talked about some financial, quote-unquote, innovations. It seems like every few months the banks are coming up with new schemes. And some accounting control weaknesses that were taking place, and all of that kind of led up to the bubble bursting. The impact has been for us a tighter credit market, a lot of individual wealth, both real and artificial, destroyed, a much more competitive job market. And what we've seen lately is sort of a recovery in the market, but as we're going to talk about, I'm going to touch on a little bit later, it's sort of been people tightening their belts has seemed to show some recovery in the market, but hasn't really been backed up with any increased sales. So I think we're starting to see now that people's belts are as tight as they can get, that the market's slumping a little bit again. The government's response, as we all know, started with the era of the bailouts, followed up by the stimulus, which has been a very short-term solution, in which we're yet to see the outcome of as that starts to fall off, and then, of course, the increased deficit, which I think we've sort of committed our grandchildren's children to. The impact for us here in New York State, as you're aware, half of our revenue is state aid, and when that funding drops off, we don't know what that's going to look like. The gap elimination has been another short-term solution, and I'll talk about some of the functions of that. And really, think the budget woes for us are going to really outlast the recession, as it usually does New York State's sort of on a year or 2 year reaction time. And then the last thing is when are we going to see normal again? Obviously, there's no sure signs, no guarantees, but the way things are looking right now, we really don't expect to see any measurable results until 2014. So that's just, and if there's anybody that joined us a little bit late, that was just sort of a recap of the webinar that took place a couple weeks ago. And so what I'm going to talk about today is the alternatives for reducing costs, some of the tools that you can use to do that, compare and contrast fixed and variable costs, controllable and uncontrollable expenses. We're going to differentiate the two because fixed doesn't always mean uncontrollable and variable doesn't always mean controllable. So just kind of want to distinguish those for you. How you can use time to save money, both from a savings and administrative standpoint, and allocating costs over multiple programs. That's sort of just a way you can get a handle on it, maximizing your grant money, and then we'll wrap up with a summary. Okay, some cost-saving alternatives. Equipment, I think, goes without saying, is kind of the low-hanging fruit. I know here in our district that was one of the first things we've done going into next year's budget is eliminated most, if not all, of the equipment money. Employee portion of healthcare is another one. I realize that's sort of a longer-term solution because that's something you're going to have to solve through negotiations, and that's something that we're looking at right now is how much our employees are paying as a portion of the health care and where we can kind of go with that. Retirement incentives versus layoffs. One of the things that our district was able to do, and I realize it's sort of an anomaly, but we were able to get through this year without laying anybody off. What we've kind of hoped is that the state retirement incentive and our local retirement incentive will induce some natural attrition, and that then we can try to avoid replacing those people. Another thing that we cut right away was traveling for professional education, trying to move to, or I should say back to, sort of an in-service type of philosophy. Getting people together in groups and bringing the speaker in. Field trips and transportation, that's another area that I don't know, I realize every district is a little bit different, but we had, within grades, we had a lot of classrooms doing their own field trips and not necessarily collaborating. And the bigger problem behind that is the cost of the transportation. So if you can get your principals and in some cases your assistant superintendents, if they're involved in your curriculum, to collaborate and get on the same page, take the same field trips within grades, and maybe even combine grades at times, you can save a lot of money in transportation expense there. Tuition reimbursement, I know this is probably a sensitive topic with a lot of people, but one of the things that you can do around that, and not suggesting that you eliminate that, but is consider a sort of a vesting period where only after a year or 2 years of service that that you might offer that, and then also sort of a time commitment after the degree or certification is obtained. And I don't know if that's standard practice or not, but it's something that we've looked at doing. So I think it's a good idea for them to have some sort of a dog in the fight, if you will. So another big thing that I noticed when I took over here was that we were spending a lot of money on comp time and overtime as a result of people working overtime, and understood that this is dependent largely on how your contracts are written. But for us, like I said, I initially looked at the overtime, and then I looked into the comp time, and I sort of put an example together just to illustrate this, because I don't think that this is extremely uncommon. What I'd like to do is just kind of walk through this, though, just to put it into perspective a little bit. You've got an hourly employee that works a total of 5 hours of overtime in a week and elects to take the comp time instead of the overtime pay if that's offered, which works out to be 7.5 hours to be used at a later date. So say this happens on average 10 out of 52 weeks in a year, and we'll also assume for these purposes that when the comp time is used, you have to hire a substitute to fill in. So this is kind of what the math looks like on that. The 7.5 hours times the 10 weeks in a year. And again, this is, I think, ultra conservative, at least in our neighborhood. I think this happens more often than not and in much bigger numbers. But so you take those 75 hours and you multiply it by their hourly rate, and then you add on the cost of the district FICA to that. And then moving on to the next slide, you add in the cost of a substitute for those same hours and add in the district portion of the FICA, and you're looking at almost another $1,000. So the total cost of this seemingly minor occurrence, adds up to be over a couple $1,000. And in our district, we're a district of about 750 employees. So even if you only take a couple hundred of those instances, it adds up quick, and you're talking in the neighborhood of close to $500,000. So I realize that when you read that example, it seems like a very minor isolated incident, but it adds up relatively quick. Some other cost-saving alternatives, again, we're talking about substitutes, and some of the other things that we've already discussed, that it being the travel for professional education, the field trips, the comp time if you have an employee who's out above and beyond their scheduled time off during the year, you're adding costs of substitutes. So evaluate how much money you're spending and especially how much you're budgeting for substitutes, because I think there can be a lot of savings there. Aids and monitors, we'll talk a little bit about aids and how you can try to envelop some of the cost of that when we're talking about grants. But these are, again, our positions, and not for anything other than the money. I realize they're important people and they're in important positions, but I think when you dig your heels into it, you'll find that in a lot of cases you can probably do without a handful of them. Special ed and IEP assessments, we've been truly blessed with our special ed director, but it seems to me that teachers more and more are kind of quick to diagnose or try to diagnose anyway a student who could just be behavioral or whatever. But when you get into even just assessing those students or even potentially placing those students, you all know the cost goes through the roof. So if you can work with your principals and them work with their teachers to cut down on the instances and address the behaviorals when they're really behavioral and not jump to conclusions real quick, I think you'll start to see some cost savings there as well. As I mentioned before, free and reduced, when we were looking at the gap elimination when it came out this year, found out that we kind of knew in the back of our mind that as far as free and reduced was concerned, that we weren't doing everything we possibly could to get more students on it. But what we didn't realize is that was going to be a function of the computation of the gap elimination. So this is really a good way to affect your aid in the long run. And this last one is, I know it's a conversation that nobody wants to have, but we've even had to reevaluate our class sizes and where we can combine. And if we do need a teacher in a certain area or in a certain building, look at where our potential candidates are and maybe where we can make some consolidations. So again, I know it's, when you start talking about that, a lot of people get very uncomfortable, but it's definitely a conversation worth having with your superintendent and your principals. Alternate scheduling is another good option. This kind of ties into the comp time and the overtime that I had brought up before, where we've started to evaluate the possibility of, because so many people have good reason for why they're there these certain hours, or why the work can't get done between this hour and that hour. And so what we've done is started to look at, can we do 4 10-hour days, or can we do 3.5 12-hour days, or whatever the case, whatever works best for you. But that's something to look at. Also, that kind of takes on two meanings, and I probably should have split this up, but then also looking at your school scheduling. What are your school hours, and do you have early programs and late programs? Can you kind of wrap those up? I'm not an educator, but in talking to our transportation people and our buildings and grounds people, this is a big cost driver, is getting certain students to school early, or picking them up early or later, or the more you can standardize your schedule, though, I think the better off you'll be. Building monitoring, we're talking about after-school programs, dances, musicals, what have you. We found that a lot of buildings were keeping oftentimes a custodian around to lock up, as well as a nurse, because of the needing somebody around who's AED certified. And our answer to that was kind of twofold. One is, if you have to have a custodian around to lock up, why don't we get the custodians AED certified, and then you eliminate the need for 2 people to be in the building. And the flip side of that is really putting the onus on your principals and asking them to try, understanding they can't be in the building every night of every week, but try to have your principals around and have them AED certified as well, so that you really cut down on the amount of hourly employees that you have in the building at night when you're having those activities. Direct deposit, if you can push, again, I know this is sort of limited to the confines of your contract, but the more that you can push direct deposit towards your employees, the better off you'll be. I think just from an administrative standpoint, I've seen studies out there for the cost of issuing a check anywhere from $15 to $40 in a business setting. And so if you can cut that down, the amount of checks you issue, I think you'll save there too. Electronic wire transfer is sort of the same concept. And the most important thing in all of this that I found is management collaboration, that being your business office, your superintendent, your if you have one, assistant superintendent curriculum, and your principals, because everybody's really got to get on the same page to make a lot of these things work. So that's it for alternatives for cost reduction. Some of the tools that I use, there's one in particular that I find above and beyond the normal reports that we do, is the statement of cash flows. Because just because there's money in the budget, there's not necessarily money in the bank. I find this a particularly useful tool just for myself, knowing where we're going to be from a cash flow standpoint. But also, when you're talking to your superintendent and your principals and stuff, sometimes it puts things into perspective that, again, just because there's money in their budget doesn't necessarily mean there's money in the bank. So for those of you who might not be familiar, I've got an example here. I've changed some of the numbers just for confidentiality, but I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of what, how I do this. Some of the revenues that you can pretty much predict, obviously, are your tax revenue and your state aid. Interest is not even really a factor these days. And then there are some things, your payroll, that you can kind of guesstimate. Your general fund warrants, your debt service should pretty much be a given. And then your interfund transfers, you can kind of guesstimate based on the prior year. But what I do down here as well is in the notes section, any assumptions that I've used. For example, here, the second one, the general fund warrants and payroll, when I did this at the beginning, this is actually going into next year, I just took 104% of prior year amounts. So again, it's a guesstimate. It's very conservative, but it also puts things into perspective. And it, if you're talking to, for example, your superintendents, it can kind of bring them down to earth a little bit. If any of you need me to send you the Excel file of this, I can certainly do that. Just, I think we're going to have access to email addresses. Just shoot me an email. I'll have my contact info. I'll have my contact info up at the end of the webinar. So feel free to shoot me an email if you'd like to get a copy of that. Some other tools that you can use, again, we're talking about cutting down administrative burden. There are timekeeping systems out there that I know are integrated with, we use Finance Manager. I assume there's probably similar programs for WinCap, but these can be a chrono system. I've even seen recently the thumbprint systems. But this will cut down a lot on the physical time cards and the input, the reconciling. All of that sort of goes away because, like I said, this is integrated with your finance software, and the information just goes right in. So those seem to be a pretty good tool. Online school lunch programs, understood that probably a lot of you are already using these. We are not, but it's something that we've looked into and are trying to move toward. This can also help if you can provide anonymity with the students, can help with your free and reduced. That usually anonymity is the selling point for parents when you're talking about trying to get them on free and reduced. Bus routing software, again, transportation is one of the top 3 expenses, as you know, and I think there's a lot to be had in the way of efficiency when you're routing. I've only seen short demos of some of the packages that are out there, so if you're not using a bus routing software, then I definitely recommend looking into it because, like I said, I just think there's a lot to be had in the way of efficiency. Same thing with asset tracking and inventory management. These, I understand there's usually a cost involved with getting on board with some of these programs, but when we're talking about saving money in the long run, I think, as far as asset tracking, it can really cut down on your theft and your inventory, your equipment that goes missing and things like that. There are barcode systems out there. There are RFID systems out there, and they're really not as expensive, I think, as a lot of people think they are. Another thing is electronic bank reconciliation. Again, this is just an administrative burden conversation, but it can also, it helps from an efficiency standpoint and from I don't know, we have had recently found that our bank was making more errors than we'd like to believe. So these are, I just think that these are all in some form or fashion, and some may be more appropriate than others for your district. But again, it's at least worth looking into. Zero-based budgeting, what I was kind of going after here was giving principals ownership over the discretionary portions of their budget. And by that I mean, if you're not already doing it, sort of separate out the personnel part, because that's sort of standard from year to year, and break down the supplies and the equipment and things like that, and put the ownership on the principals in the building to come up with a budget of what they need, and try to get away from the typical use it or lose it philosophy. I think, and I've talked to people who have said that this has worked out well for them. If every year you can sort of have them plan all of their activities and say, okay, this is what we're going to need, not let's start with what we had last year and see how much more we need. If you're as forgiving from year to year with, if they don't use all their money, not saying, okay, well then you didn't need it last year, you're not going to need it next year. Just kind of reward them for that honesty. And like I said, I think it cuts down on the unnecessary spending where they get to the end of the year and they have this money and they really feel like they've got to spend it or else they're not going to get it in their budget next year. So like I said, I've talked to several people that have said that worked well for them, and so again, it might be something if you're not doing to consider moving towards. Perform cost-benefit analysis of outsourcing and contracting services. This can be good and bad. So when you're doing this, consider the implicit costs, whereas if you take this on yourself, how many additional things is this going to cause, or how many more people is this going to require to make it work, or what kind of technical support or maintenance, or just consider all of the things that are implicit in taking this on yourself, and then also consider the sunk costs, or the things that you're going to have to assume anyways, whether you contract this out or you don't contract this out. So really this is just food for thought, but I just wanted to kind of get you thinking along those lines when you're performing your cost-benefit analysis. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is fixed versus variable costs. For those of you who aren't familiar with the terms, fixed costs are expenses that don't change in proportion to the activity of the business within a relevant period. That they're just that, they're fixed. You're going to pay for your buildings, you're going to pay for your utilities, you're going to pay for your insurance regardless. And then the variable costs are expenses that are volume related and do change in proportion to the activity of a business. And really, those two types of expenses should make up your total expense. Here are just some examples, again, of fixed costs. Your teacher administrator salaries, your contractual expenses, your debt service. Your utilities should be relatively fixed, understood that they fluctuate a little bit each month, but are generally stable. Insurance, same thing, legal fees, and your support staff. And then some variable costs, your hourly employees, your extracurriculars, textbooks, employee benefits, and workers' comp. And when you're looking at these variable costs and what you can do to save on them is really consider what's driving that cost. Again, we've talked about the overtime and the comp time. So when you're talking about your hourly employees, how many hours are they working? How many hours do you really need them to work? I know a lot of that there, again, are contractual implications, but just like I said, consider the driver. The textbooks you really can't do anything about, and that's why I mentioned earlier, your variable doesn't necessarily mean a controllable cost, so we're going to talk about that too. Just some more variable costs here. Out-of-district tuition, health services, postage, fuel, supplies. You know, it is somewhat variable, but the more control you gain over that, I think you'll find it becomes more and more fixed. So, controllable and uncontrollable expenses. Here are some controllable expenses. Employee health care. There are some things you can do in the way of that if you're not already. I don't know. I sit on the Health Consortium Board here, and we've not only have we kind of been beating up Blue Cross over administrative fees and such, but also talking about what else is out there. Does it make sense to be self-insured? Anything that you can do in the short term to relieve the pressure of the cost of health care is certainly going to go a long way. Retiree health care, what are you doing in the long term? What is in the contract now, and what can you do to start chipping away at that? Certainly not suggesting that you abolish it completely, but again, it's a huge expense, and if you can start now working on what can we do for that in the long term, I think you'll be much better off. We talked about the cost of issuing checks. Again, if you can get people on direct deposit, there are a lot of things you can do to cut down on the number of checks that you're writing, and there are all the way down the line. I think you're going to see the effects of the administrative burden that cuts. Supplies, again, something that you have ultimate control over. Auditor fees, and I don't know, again, we're a bigger district, so I don't know how much leeway you have. This kind of requires that you have some accounting experience in your business office, but I found when I came here that there were certain calculations and certain work papers and things that in the past we had always relied on our auditor to handle for us. And I realized that it's pretty common practice to rely on your auditor to prepare your financials. The reality is that as a district, and I don't think many do from what I've heard, is that you should be preparing your financials and they should really just be reviewing them. Again, that requires some accounting experience in your business office, and that's something you can consider moving forward when you're interviewing. But all of these things you can do to kind of beat up on your auditors and reduce the fees. Extracurricular expenses, the number of programs that you're offering after school and the clubs and such. Consider maybe capping that and saying, okay, we can justify this, but is there something else that maybe we can live without? So consider that. Comp time, overtime, again, ultimately at the business office level, at the administrator level, principals, you should have ultimate control over that. Sometimes that's a hard beast to wrestle, but it's, again, it can be a $500,000 or $1 million conversation that you're having if you have a lot of that in your district. Banking and investment fees, again, talk with your bankers, shop them around. Bottom line when I'm talking to banks is I just tell them we don't pay fees. That's the bottom line. And if you find that they're nickel and diming you to death, then don't be afraid to speak up or to shop around. Same thing with third-party administrator fees. Whether it be healthcare or if you're talking about your 403B administrators, all of those things, your 105H or Section 125, all of those come with fees, and so don't be afraid to reassess and try to negotiate and try to shop around as much as possible. some uncontrollable expenses, textbooks, software, retirement contributions, cafeteria losses. We're talking about if your cafeteria fund operates in the red, especially times like these, we particular have a problem with parents not paying their students' lunch bills, and so if you have cafeteria losses, unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do about that. But again, we talked about the free and reduced as kind of a solution to that. Litigation expenses and awards, not really a lot you can do about that. Building operations, transportation, students with needs, and your contractual increment costs. So again, I just want to impress upon you that variable doesn't necessarily mean controllable, and fixed doesn't necessarily mean controllable. We talk about timing. Retirement incentives. I assume that probably many of you, just like we have looked into a local incentive. And when we were entering into those conversations, I made the point that we should consider paying this out over 3 years or more, because it's going to be a huge expense in total, and so the more we can spread that out, the less painful it's going to be. From an accounts payable standpoint, if you can get, the first thing that comes to mind is utilities. If you can get on a quarterly billing cycle, or even sometimes an annual billing cycle, that'll save you, whatever little interest you're making on your money, as well as, again, the administrative burden. And timely and standardized billing, we're talking about accounts receivable. Just a few examples here: foster tuition, health services, and out-of-district tuition. Filing your FS-25s timely, just to get the money in, if nothing else. Again, I realize interest rates aren't great right now, and investment opportunities are pretty limited, but just to have that money on hand, and every little bit of interest you can earn will help. Debt service, I assume that you all are pretty on pretty regular schedules, but if you are making those payments early, I would recommend waiting and paying them on the day of. I know it's a responsible thing to do, but usually we're talking about big dollars, so the longer you can hang on to that, the better. Monitor investment opportunities. This kind of ties into developing relationships with your financial advisors. I usually once a month, maybe more often, I get calls from people talking about money markets or just all kinds of different things. And again, I know the market isn't now, it's not now what it used to be, but when it does start to recover, these are it's good to have these relationships. And then another big one for us, again, and I don't know how common this is talk to your auditors about booking deferred revenues. We had a problem where we have a Native American school, and we were billing the state, and we weren't getting paid for 18 to 24 months. And historically, we had been booking it as revenue at the time we billed the state, but not getting the money for a couple of years, and so we sort of artificially were inflating our fund balance. So this can give you a little more wiggle room if you're in a position to have money to put in your fund balance. So just something to think about and talk about with your auditors. We talk about allocating costs to multiple programs. If you're not already doing it, certainly apply multiple payroll codes where appropriate. And we'll talk about this a little bit too with the grants, but it's a good way to measure what you're spending on each program, so it'll help you better assess the profitability and the business sense of certain programs. one thing that we're moving toward is including field trips in the building budgets. We're making principals account for the cost of running a field trip, and this goes back to my conversation I had a little bit earlier about field trips, and that is put it on them to collaborate with their teachers, and to and when they start to see the dollars that are associated with that, there's a little more thought that goes into the decision making, and I think you'll start to see the costs go down. Allocating your other transportation expenses to relevant programs, cut down on those miles that aren't aidable is the bottom line. But again, allocating those specifically to the programs to better identify what you're spending on those programs so you can make better decisions around whether to keep them or replace them or what have you. Making better use of your object function and location codes. We don't, I think, do as much as we possibly can, but the more that you can do, and I realize it's somewhat tedious, but the more you can apply the cost to a certain function or a certain location, the better information you're going to have and the better decisions I think you're going to be able to make. All of this kind of wraps up into promoting accountability. The more that you can put on specific buildings and departments and programs, the more you're going to start to flush out some of the unnecessary expenses. If you're paying stipends, again, make sure those get allocated to their respective programs. If you don't already, use a separate budget for summer school. Certainly I would recommend that. And then create, just locally, it can just be an Excel sheet, but create local budget for your extracurriculars. We had a new person took over the high school musical this year, and after decades of operating in the red, was able to not only lower the ticket prices, but make it profitable. So again, the more you can get a clear picture of what's being spent on what and who's doing what, the more it comes to light how you can do things better. And then the last thing really I want to talk about is making better use of your grants. Encourage, I know this isn't grants in the typical sense, but encourage your teachers and your principals to get involved with local grants. This is not a huge revenue generator, but every little bit helps, especially in the building level. So definitely educate and encourage them to get involved with that. Evaluate your use of integrated classrooms, and by that I mean classrooms, and I don't know all the terminology around students with special needs, but in classrooms where you do have one or two or maybe even more students with special needs in a typical classroom, consider allocating the wages for that aid on a percentage basis. So you may not always be doing that, but that's a good way to, if you can envelop some of the cost of that in your grants, I think you'll start to see results there. Research additional grants. I realize that oftentimes above and beyond your typical, I kind of call them the top 10 grants. You're not talking about big dollars, and you are. I know that there's paperwork involved, and sometimes it almost doesn't seem worth it. But we found that as we look deeper, that there are a substantial number of grants out there to be had. So get the applications going where you can. One of the things that we do, and I don't know, again, how standard this practice is, but just kind of wanted to share it with you in case you're not already doing it, is multiple fund codes. Probably most of you have seen this around your capital funds where you've got H and then some sort of identifier after it to identify each individual project. If you're not already doing it, though, similarly, we do this in Finance Manager so that we can run a separate trial balance, we can run a separate appropriation status, and it makes it a lot easier to see what we're spending, what's available, what we've received. So just a little, just a little tip there, if you're not doing that already, to you can see the year indicator there. You can either use 2 letters in a two-digit year, or a lot of ours you see the 3 digits in the one-digit year. I don't know. It's kind of, we've tried to maximize how many people we can pay out of our grants, and we've done that by applying their benefits just to the general fund. But I think I was having this conversation with my special ed director, and I'm not really sure what the pros and cons are, but it just seems better practice to us that we should get into the habit of kind of encapsulating the benefits so that we can see the true cost of having those employees. And sometimes you might be able to justify other expenses better through that particular grant, and maybe it makes more sense. But like I said, we kind of were talking about it and just decided it seems to me it would be a better practice to cover their benefits out of the grants when possible. Purchase services and equipment. Again, when you're talking about students with special needs, particularly, make sure that you're allocating appropriately to the grants. I just a couple of the circulars where I got some of my information. If you want to look into it further, I've put them there. The A87, A133. And just to kind of summarize, again, it's really, to me, it seems very important to understand the causes as well as the solutions. Continuously evaluate your cost-saving alternatives. For us, in education, revenues are not likely to go up significantly anytime soon. So for us, it's going to have to be profitability through cost reduction. And so, like I said, every little bit that you can do now, I think, is going to pay dividends in the long run. Certainly don't count on the government or the taxpayers to solve your financial problems. I would say that probably both personally and professionally. We're kind of on our own now. We're not, but in a sense we are. So it's really up to us to make the difference now and to cut costs where we can, the best we can. I know a lot of these conversations that you're going to have, both with your buildings and your superintendents and things, they're going to be wildly unpopular and grossly painful. You talk about change and bringing people outside of their box, and it's not likely to draw a popular result. So, but use the tools that we've discussed, and certainly research and develop others. I would definitely welcome any ideas that you have, things that you're doing differently, things that are working, things that are not working, and share those with the group. Only good can come from networking and sharing those ideas. Leverage your available technologies. We talked about a lot of the online, there's software, there's online programs, there's a lot of technologies out there that aren't being used or aren't being used to their full potential. So certainly the more you research that and the more you share it, the better off we'll all be. Promote and ensure accountability. Again, the more that you can identify where these costs go, you'll start to see where there's expenses that there shouldn't be or there should be more of. And again, this isn't just to to cut down on everything, but I think you'll find that there are places where there's a lot of money going to waste. Understanding your variable and fixed costs. Again, the key to that is understanding what is driving those variable expenses, and then not only understanding what's driving them, but can you control those cost drivers, and what can you do to control those? And I put it here again, I can't say it enough, that fixed doesn't necessarily mean uncontrollable, and variable doesn't mean controllable. So make sure you understand the difference between those two. And also consider the time value of money. It's, I realize the markets aren't great now, but I'm sure there will be a day. So the sooner you can sort of get into the habit or the practice of maximizing your cash on hand, I think the better off you'll be in the long run. Again, maximize the use of your grant money. That understood that the federal government isn't in much better shape as the state, but the more you can do now to sort of offset the state's shortcomings with federal money, I think the better off you'll be. And don't discount local grants. I know they're typically not large dollar signs, but like I said, teachers generally find a way to make those go a long way. So that can do a lot for your buildings. Communicate and operate as a management team. As I mentioned, a lot of this is going to come down to how well you collaborate with your directors, with your principals, and with your superintendents, and how well, even more importantly, how well they can communicate with their teams. So the more that, the closer you can get to having everybody on the same page, the better off you're going to be. And empower your directors and principals. Again, if you make them accountable, I think you're going to see results. And if you don't, then you kind of have a choice to make. So it's a step in the right direction. And just a quote here is, and be the change you want to see in the world. I came into this, and I don't want to say necessarily that it was a mess, but one of the first things I had to do was, in order for me to go on a campaign to cut down on overtime in the district, was I had to completely cut off the overtime in the business office, because it has to start at the top. You've got to set the tone, and so I felt this quote was probably the most appropriate for today. And then here's my contact information. If any of you have any questions or need anything, if you want a copy of my cash flow statement, I'd be happy to send it to you, or reach out to me for anything you need. I'd be happy to help you where I can. And like I said, the more we network and the more we share information, I think the better off we'll all be. And with that, I will take any questions that anybody has, or Steve, if you want to.
Yeah, I'll jump right in here if you don't mind.
Sure.
I think you just answered this question, but we did have Sandra had written in saying that she did like the spreadsheet, and if we could get a copy of that emailed to the participants. And I just said when we get to the Q&A, I'll ask about that.
Yeah.
I think you just said you'd be willing to share the spreadsheet that you have, and that you put together for that. So the answer to that question, then, Sandra, is yes. Tim can make it available to us, and then we can provide it to all the participants of this webinar.
Yep.
So that was the only chat question that had come in. I'd like to formally enter our Q&A period. And I think Michelle is still with us, and Michelle can again review what you need to do to go into a voice question.
Thank you, Steve. Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who would like to ask an audio question, please press 7# on your telephone now. You'll be placed in queue and your order received. Again, 7# to ask an audio question, or you can send chat questions.
Okay, and while we wait for anybody who wants to enter into a voice question. We did here have another question submitted via the chat, which was Charlene asking where we can get information about additional grants and local grants available to us. Tim, if you wanted to.
As far as federal grants, in order not to mislead you, I'd like to talk to our business official, get some information and email it out to the group if that's okay. But as far as local grants, a lot of them I've seen come through either the BOCES or local universities. There are, I know several of the mini grants that we have come from our local community college as well as Niagara University just up the road. They often run programs where they actually house the grants there. They'll apply for the grant and then they'll sort of distribute that on a need basis or sometimes a merit basis. But like I said, I haven't personally been involved with the seeking those out necessarily. I can speak to where I know the money comes from because I'm the district treasurer. Aside from that, I would check. I would start there. I honestly don't know. I can try and find out if anybody has any other ideas on that.
This is Steve again. We can also help provide. I don't have them right at my fingertips at the moment, but we've had questions like that come into the ASBO office before, and we have been able to identify some resources for kind of web-based clearinghouses for what grants are available from not only from not as many local and regional, but not-for-profit foundations that deal a lot with the educational community. There are clearinghouse websites for those, and I believe we also do have some contact information regarding federal grants and where you can access information about those. So what I'll do is when we send out our email with the spreadsheet, we can also include some web links that can take you to some of those resources.
Great.
Do we have anyone right now who's waiting in the queue to ask a question via phone?
Currently, no audio questions, Steve.
Okay. Well, we do have some time left on this. We'll just wait here for a second. Would encourage you right now. We do have 15 people who are still on the webinar. If you have any questions about what you've heard, is to not take any more minutes. But if you've got them, fire them away.
Steve, we do have an audio question from Valhalla UFSD.
Hi, this is Charlene Ercole. I'm the treasurer here in Valhalla.
Yes.
It's not so much a question as it is a comment where you say that things have to start from the top down as far as making changes. It's very difficult here. We're trying to get our principals and administrators to sort of follow the rules and guidelines that we're trying to get across as far as cutting certain expenditures. It is very difficult, and with our new software program, I think this will make it, they will be more accountable for their budgets and how they spend their money.
Absolutely.
We are going on to finance manager. So I am hoping that this will allow them to see, how they're spending their money and hopefully become more frugal with it.
Certainly, I believe it will, and just so you're aware, Finance Manager, you'll have the capabilities. We have the principal is ultimately responsible for approving purchase orders within the buildings, and this is all done in Finance Manager, and usually they designate one of their secretaries to input the purchase order. So there's a level of approval for purchasing there. It also does allow them to view reports and see how their money is being spent and how they're doing with their budget and things like that. So certainly it makes the conversations go a lot smoother when you're talking to them about where they're at with their budget.
Most definitely. Well, thank you. I just wanted to get that across.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Do we have any other voice questions or comments in the queue?
No questions on queue. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to ask an audio question, please press 7# on your telephone now.
Okay. Well, I think that we're going to wrap this up a few minutes earlier than we might have. We do have a chat question coming in here. I like the idea of running AP warrants every 2 weeks. We run every week, and I'd like to change this. Also, we just completed a campaign for direct deposit, and we'll be using the employee self-service module on WinCap within the next few months. This module allows employees to look at their pay stub online. We will not issue direct deposit paper backup soon.
That's fantastic. Yeah, we do also run biweekly check runs, and I think one thing I didn't really mention in here, and you bring up a good point, is trying to go paperless. Sort of. We've put a lot of information out. We have our own business office section of our school district's website, and one of the things I've been really working towards since I got here was putting the information out there on the website and directing people to that, and let them go to the information. I think you'll find that you spend a lot less time people calling you up for a healthcare application or a direct deposit form, or I mean, you name it. There's hundreds out there, but like I said, the more you can get that information out there on the internet, and again, be mindful of the confidentiality, but I think you'll find that you save a lot administratively there too.
We also we have someone waiting to ask an audio question.
Yes, it's Charlene Ercole.
Yes, hi. I do have a question regarding the field trips in the building budgets.
Mm-hmm.
What did you mean by having the principals or something go on the field trips with the teachers? I didn't quite get that.
No. What I really am moving toward is having the principals be responsible for budgeting. You're still going to have the cost of the transportation under the transportation budget, but make them responsible for, give them a location code, field trips for high school. Make them budget for X number of field trips per year, and then they're committed to, maybe instead of this one field trip, they're going to do 2 smaller field trips or whatever the case may be. But make them commit to put dollars and signs on it and make them accountable for how much they're spending on field trips, because what we found is happening is right now, anytime anybody wants to go on a field trip, all they have to do is call transportation, and transportation makes it happen, and they never see the inner workings of that. But that is a huge expense, and I think, like I said, the more you can make them accountable for that, you're going to start to see that go way down.
Yes. Oh, that's good. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
We have Michelle Matthijs has forwarded a chat question, which is, do you find that providing forms on your website is working for you, or do employees call anyway? I've been discussing trying to approach this in my district.
Yes, it has been a blessing for us. We found that the people that do call, we walk them through and guide them to the website to get them in the habit of doing that. And so there's a little bit of a transition period there, but I have found that has been amazing, because usually every year around open enrollment, we have 750 employees. We probably get 550 phone calls for forms. So I think that has been one of the greatest things for us. But again, I want to clarify, be careful, because we came close to putting some information out there that shouldn't have been, and make sure that there's nothing confidential. We had one form that specifies a dollar figure for administrators' health care that shouldn't have been out there. So that's the one I'm speaking of in particular. But just be mindful of that when you're putting forms on the website.
Okay. Do we have any other audio questions?
No audio questions at the moment, Steve.
Okay. Again, we have still about 11 people participating. So if don't delay if you have a question. Tim, if you don't mind, while we wait to see if something pops into somebody's mind, you mentioned that when you came into your district, you found some things a bit of a mess when you got there, and you've been taking some steps. Maybe you could comment a little bit on kind of how you did the triage. Is when you saw some things where there were some opportunities for cost savings, or some things that you wanted to. How did you decide what to do first? Was there kind of a plan that you put into place, or did you kind of just take them as they kind of came to you, or was there for someone who may be walking into something new themselves?
Sure. It's kind of cliche, but organize and prioritize. You've kind of got to break it up into pieces, and then take a look and see what are the big pieces. For me, it was kind of a no-brainer that we were spending $750,000 or close to, I think, on overtime. So that was a no-brainer. That was the first thing I went after. Just break it up into pieces, and then I think probably the most important thing is if you're not at the business official level, to get them involved and get their support with it, and then if you are sort of the same process, get your superintendent on board, get them involved, because you're not going to force that change unless you have total management support. So again, collaborate and communicate with your leadership team, and just tackle the low-hanging fruit first, and once you've put a dent in that, sort of move on to the next biggest thing. And you also have to pick your battles and understand that it's not going to happen overnight. A lot of these things are limited to the confines of a contract, and that can take years, maybe decades, to get reformed. So, but just be tenacious, get after it, and don't give up, no matter how many roadblocks. That was seemed like every which way I turned there was a roadblock. But and not that all of our problems are solved either. It's an ongoing, continuous process of improvement. So it's an uphill battle, but to me it's a battle worth fighting.
Okay. Do we have anyone submitting an audio question?
No audio questions at the moment.
No. Okay. Well, having no more chats and no one on the audio at the moment, I would like to draw it to a conclusion here. Excuse me. If you have any questions that as you go back through and look at the materials, and something pops into your head, or that you wished you'd asked, you can still do that. You can certainly, you have Tim's email address here still on the screen, which I'm sure he would be willing to accept questions after we conclude. You can certainly send them to New York State ASBO, and we can contact Tim, or we can also draw on some other resources to help you with getting those questions answered. What I would like to do is to remind those of you who are participating in this webinar as part of the General Principles for School Finance, the online course. The third installment of that, I hope you have it on your calendars for the next webinar, which is June 22nd at 2 o'clock. The topic for that one is communicating with your superintendent and board. If you're not already registered through the Principles of School Finance course, you can certainly register for that if you have an interest, and you can look on our events section of our website to get more information about it. So again, I would like to thank all of you for participating today on this section. I'd like to thank Tim for taking the time to share his experience with this obviously very important topic. So again, next webinar in this series is June 22nd, and thank you all very much.
Thanks, Steve.
Have a good afternoon.
This concludes today's New York State ASBO webinar. Thank you to our sponsor today, Building Controls and Services, Inc., and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending.